So let's dive right into it, Sonia. So of course we do this weekly where we talk about the effects of the coronavirus on Canadian immigration. That includes travel and what companies should know and all that good stuff. Presented by both of our companies, so Visto.ai and SMB Business Immigration. Will do a quick introduction in a second after the agenda. So number one, we'll do a quick intro of both Sonia and I. We'll talk about individuals and travel specifically and the most recent updates. There actually have been a few this week. Sonia will go even more in depth into companies and what they should know, especially if they have LMIAs. And then, of course, we will stick around for a live Q&A if there are any questions to answer. So really quickly, who are we? I'm Josh Schachnow, Canadian immigration lawyer and CEO of Visto at Visto.ai. We are a free platform helping skilled workers through the express entry process. Sonia is the principal partner of SMB Business Law at smblaw.ca. And our quick disclaimer, we are doing this for general informational purposes only, so this does not create any of those fancy lawyer-client relationships and privileges. Just want to make that abundantly clear from the outset. So, really quick note as well for previous updates, because we do this every week. There's two things you should definitely keep an eye on. Number one is our special measures Google Doc. So we have a live Google Doc I update it every week after we do this session. And so I will link to it in the Facebook chat in just a few minutes, so you can keep tabs on that link. Every week you can check back for the latest updates, especially after we report on them. If you're watching this video after the fact, you can find the link to it in the description below, likely on YouTube. And of course, if you do want to watch previous update videos, you can check out the Visto YouTube channel as well. Just be careful, because some of the things that we've reported on in the past have since been updated. So I always recommend checking the most, just one or two recent videos to stay up to date with that. So with that being said, let's get into the updates from this past week. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the individuals. Sonia will also touch on that a little bit, as well as the company side of things. So again, really important are the travel exemptions that were put in place for study permit holders, work permit holders, and those approved for PR. The key notes here are that for numbers 1 and 3 on the list here, so study permit holders and those approved for PR, it's those who were approved before March 18th. That's kind of the key date here to keep in mind. So if you're approved after that, then you are not part of the travel exemptions and you shouldn't be traveling to Canada. All work permit holders, previous and current, assuming you still have the valid work permit or you've gotten a new valid work permit, are able to travel into the country. Sonia will talk a little bit more, and we'll both touch a little bit more on the actual travel itself in just a second. But those are some of the key travel exemptions in place. There is a much longer list of travel exemptions that are in place, so definitely take a look at the Google Doc. Again, I'm going to post it in the chat in just a second here for the full list of exemptions. Now, we've gotten a little bit of new guidance on what's required on landing. So this is anybody traveling into the country. They've gotten even more stringent on what's required to travel to the country. It even starts at the airport, no matter where you're coming from, right? So Sonia, I think, is going to go into more detail on this, but airlines are now checking health and kind of your eligibility to even board the plane in general. They're going to check for symptoms, and especially on landing and clearing customs in Canada with the CBSA, you have to show that you have no symptoms, and you have to have an in-depth plan in place for your 14-day quarantine, which is mandatory for anybody landing in Canada, whether you're part of that travel exemption or a citizen or PR or anything like that. So this is going to include things like where are you going to stay, right? Where are you going to quarantine? Making sure it's away from other people, especially those who are vulnerable. Plan for how you're going to get your food, how you're going to get medicine if needed, all that type of stuff. We have a direct link in that Google Doc with the full set of instructions if you're going to be or have already or will be traveling to Canada sometime soon. Take an in-depth look into that guide on exactly how to prepare for your travel and your quarantine. There are serious penalties. You'll see the link in the Google Doc for not abiding by those closely enough. Lastly, I'll quickly touch on international students. So obviously, schools have been affected in many ways. If you have been approved for a study permit and are starting in May and June, or for a future semester potentially in the near future, do know that for right now, Immigration Canada has put in an exemption allowing you to take those courses online, assuming they're offered online, and count that towards your postgrad work permit eligibility. Now, they still are putting that 50% limitation in place. So you are allowed taking online courses. However, they cannot make up more than 50% of your program. But don't worry, because those first, maybe it's a few months or first semester or two, assuming it doesn't make up more than 50% of your program, even the online courses will still count towards postgrad work permit eligibility and length of the permit, which is obviously super important. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Sonia now to talk about companies and some other considerations as well. Sonia, take it away.
Thank you, Josh. Is there any way that I can see the agenda? I can't see it right now. So that I know that I can
Yeah,
talk
your
based on
3 points are I sent them in an email as well, the new developments for
Okay.
employers,
Okay,
the
so you haven't
updates on
changed the
entry.
order.
No,
Okay.
exact
Okay,
same
great.
order. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, in terms of employers that are applying to bring foreign workers to Canada under the LMIA Labor Market Impact Assessment, their new developments, new guidelines came into effect as of literally a day ago. So initially, a couple of weeks ago, Service Canada what they introduced to what they announced to the employers was that they're not going to make the audits or reviews for the employers, considering the whole effects of this COVID situation on the businesses. However, yesterday, they sent an email to all employers, including the immigration practitioners, confirming that there will be an audit or there will be an inspection, virtual inspection or remote inspection of the employer complying with the 14-day isolation period, mandatory for the employees that are the foreign workers that are coming to Canada. And also, for in case of employers that are providing a space or residence for the employees, the setup of the residence and how employees will have to interact for the number of employees that are living there in a group, how they would have to interact, and how what are the necessities from the employer's side to provide at that location. So essentially, what happens is that Service Canada is being very strict on it. They will send a request to employer, and the employer is required to respond within 48 hours. Like I said, the inspection will be done virtually or remotely, whatever that means, probably through phone, I'm expecting. And so the employer is obligated to provide a wage with the the minimum wage that's been indicated on the LMIA application, or at least equivalent to 30 hours of work within that 2-week period of self-isolation, and the employee should not be working, is not required to work. So Service Canada is essentially looking for documentation to prove that the payment has been done to the employee, so pay slips or any document that shows that employer is abiding by the rule, and also the photos of the place that employer is providing to the employees. And I'm assuming that comes really into play in a case of foreign workers that are coming here as a temporary workers to work in the forestry industry. So employer is providing a place of residence, making sure that employees are self-distanced with each other, providing sanitization, material. And so employer is required to provide all the proof that this has been done. So photos or video, virtual videos of the place is mandatory. So essentially, providing the documentation to Service Canada that employer is following the rules as set out under the Quarantine Act. Now, there are severe penalties for the employers that are not abiding by the rules, as a monetary penalty of up to $1 million, which I figured it's quite extensive in this case, or 1 to 10 year of abandonment from filing further LMIA
Just running to the door quickly
applications.
for 1 second, Sonia. Go ahead.
No problem. Or canceling all the previous LMIAs that has been issued for that company. So that's that. Last week I touched upon a little bit about dependent family members and sort of like a fuzzy situation that we were at last week as to how the dependent family members are allowed to enter Canada with the main applicants, main applicant being the worker or being a PR holder. Now, it wasn't clear up to last week that whether how to interpret this reuniting factor. So when a couple of weeks ago, immigration provided this whole guideline, new guideline as to who are the dependent family members and how they can travel with the main applicant, there was order in council that came into effect that was basically a new law. And what it was saying in order in council, the main factor to look at was the reuniting factor. But what we were seeing was that in some cases, the workers were coming with their family members and they were fine, they could pass the border. But in other cases, the family members were being scrutinized by the CBSA officer. And at some point, they were being returned back to their home country. Right now, it's very clear. Immigration has been giving us a very clear instruction that the reuniting factor has to be in place. So what that essentially means is that the worker has to land in Canada first, aside from the family members, and then the family members can come right after. Now, in a case of family members that obviously have only visitor visas to come to Canada, they would have to make sure that they get special authorizations by immigration office before landing into Canada. That's crucial. They wouldn't even be able to land on a plane if they're coming through air, or they'll be returned back to their country if they're coming through land port of entry. So again, as I mentioned, I've been very clear on instructing my own clients, advising my own clients that, the main person has to land in Canada first. It doesn't have, there's no limitation on what time the family members or how many days apart the family members would have to arrive in Canada, but they have to follow this reuniting factor. Again, last week I touched upon that optional discretionary test versus the essential test and what immigration has been, outlined in the guidelines and what CBSA is really implementing. Since last week, again, there has been a very clear instruction by Immigration Office, and I checked that many times with my other colleague practitioners who are dealing with the clients. There's only really one test, and it should, the government, the different levels of government should really be trying to be on the same page as to how to interpret the guidelines. And that is really, if the person has work in Canada, if the work still exists, and the job offer exists, the employment contract is valid, the person can travel to Canada. There's no restrictions on that. So we don't necessarily, I as a practitioner, when I'm submitting a submission letter, I don't necessarily have to go into details of explaining whether this work is essential in Canada or not, whether it falls within the healthcare, in the category of healthcare providers or in the category of infrastructure services. I don't really have to go into details, as I understand, as long as the job offer is valid in Canada, the contract, like I said, is up to date, the person can travel to Canada. So I guess the ultimate line that everybody can think about and answer is whether entering to Canada is optional, no, whether it's discretionary, no, boom. So regardless of who's making the decision, CBSA officer, immigration officer, whatever that is, if the answer to those questions are no, and if the work is valid in Canada, you're good to come to Canada. It was a few points that I wanted to mention. It looks like Canadian government has given authority to airlines, and that's the new development that we've seen in the past few days since our last updates last week. So there's a group which I like to call them a border group. There are airport airlines involved, and then there's a CBSA officer involved, and then there's the immigration office that, sets out the rules, and there's this Health Canada office, I don't recall the exact name, that is setting the Quarantine Act and the consequences of not abiding by that act. So there are like 4 different bodies that are involved here.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, they're trying to be coherent as much as possible. But what I've seen in my own clients' case is that, unfortunately, because things are still very fluid, some of the border offices are interpreting things differently. So it really ultimately goes back to the decision of the CBSA officer when you're coming through, either by air or by land. There's not so much discrepancy at the airports, but there are some, different interpretations that we're seeing in the different land port of entries that we're hoping that, we could sort of get them all in line in the next week or so. So what I meant by this border group is that when people are trying to fly into Canada, the first line of people that are checking the documentations are really airline people. So if you don't have the proper authorizations in place to get on a board, you will not be boarded on the plane. Or not only the authorizations, if you don't have a proper work visa, if you don't have a proper student visa to show that you've got your documentations in place to travel to Canada, you're not allowed to get on a plane. This comes really crucial in a case of people that essentially didn't need work permit and wanted to apply, not that they didn't need, but wanted to apply for work permit once landing in Canada. So they don't need a visa to travel to Canada. Let's say if somebody's coming through any of the European countries, they don't need a visa, they have a valid job offer, and before this whole COVID situation, they would just hop on a plane, get an ETA, which is a very fast online process, come to Canada, apply for the work permit at the port of entry. That is not being done anymore because obviously, going back to my argument, they can't even board on a plane because they don't have work visa to board on a plane. So they'll be stopped at that point. In this case, right now, whoever that's coming from those countries or whoever that didn't need work visa before to come to Canada, they would have to apply for their work visa prior to coming to Canada. Immigration office, immigration department is setting up the rules, but CBSA is implementing it. So there are some discrepancies here and there. Some of the clients might fall into that trap, but we're hoping that, and I'm hoping that essentially government will pull things together in the next few weeks. Government has been terrific in setting up the rules so far, and I'm sure that all these discrepancies will be flattened out in the next few weeks as well.
Yeah, and that's always kind of been, I don't want to say a big problem, but a small issue, right, Sonia, in some cases where we have IRCC putting in all these rules, and now we have more than just the IRCC putting all these rules, but ultimately when you're landing in Canada, the first people you hit are at CBSA at Customs. And
Right.
so that little extra disconnect, has caused some people some issues. I think we'd all agree in saying that now more so than ever, have your documentation done properly. Make sure you're clearly part of an exemption or whatever it is that's required to allow you to travel. Have support letters. Make everything abundantly clear for that CBSA officer
Right.
to give yourself the best chance.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. I urge all of my clients to contact me when they're the foreign workers that are outside of Canada, to contact me and give me the exact travel plan of when they're arriving in Canada. The ones that have dependent family members, also exact plan of when the dependents are planning to travel to Canada, in order to make sure that we have all the authorizations in place. All the extra steps that didn't need to be taken before that are in place right now, making sure that we're covering everything, and also explaining in detail on my submission letter a whole bunch of things about Quarantine Act and the travel exemptions and everything, just to make sure, referring to Josh's point, just to make sure that all the loopholes are covered. And for those of you who are listening and you're not my client, obviously, you can contact my office. If you're planning to travel to Canada, you can contact my office to understand exactly what documents are involved, depending on your situation, and how you could safeguard yourself not to be rejected or turned back or anything crazy at the border.
Yep, and that's a good segue. I have our final slide up as we're done with the presentation portion. Thanks everyone for tuning in live. If you do want to get in touch directly, as Sonia mentioned, you can reach out to her, Sonia at smblaw.ca. I am at josh@visto.ai. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We'll do a quick Q&A period. If you're watching this after the fact, highly recommend following the Facebook page for Visto. That's where we go live every week to give you more of these updates. Again, check out that Google document, as I'll be updating that right after this video as well. And it should be in the description if you're watching after the fact too. So thanks very much for tuning in. Hope to see you in the next video.